They were told Americans would torture them, assault them, kill them slowly. But when 342 Japanese women stepped off trains into Camp McCoy, Wisconsin in the bitter winter of 1945, the enemy broke them not with violence, but with something far more unsettling. That first night, as fear kept them awake in their barracks, they heard boots crunching through snow outside. Hour after hour, all through the darkness. The Americans were standing guard, not to keep them in, to keep danger out. They expected death. What they got would haunt them for the rest of their lives. If this story moves you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from World War II. Before Camp McCoy, there was the ship. Before the ship, there was the surrender. The women had been gathered from various locations across the Pacific Theater, some from Manila, others from Singapore, a few from smaller outposts that had fallen to American forces. They had been nurses, translators, clerical workers, communications operators. They had served the Japanese military in various capacities, believing they were doing their patriotic duty, when Japan's position became desperate. When the tide of war turned irreversibly, these women found themselves trapped. Some had tried to flee, others had hidden. A few had attempted to take their own lives rather than face capture. But eventually they were all gathered together, processed as prisoners of war, and loaded onto American transport ships bound for the United States. The Pacific crossing took 3 weeks. 3 weeks in the belly of a ship surrounded by uncertainty and terror. The women had been told stories, terrible stories about what Americans did to Japanese prisoners, especially women. They expected to be thrown overboard. They expected starvation. They expected abuse. Instead, they were given bunks, blankets, and regular meals. The food was simple but adequate. The guards were professional and distant. No one touched them. No one threatened them. The contradiction began even before they reached American soil. The train ride from San Francisco had taken 3 days. 3 days of fear, uncertainty, and whispered prayers. The women huddled together in the passenger cars, their thin cotton dresses offering little protection against the bitter cold seeping through the windows. They were nurses, teachers, translators, and clerks who had served the Japanese military throughout the Pacific. Some had worked in field hospitals, others had operated radio equipment or managed supplies in occupied territories. Now they were prisoners of war, traveling deep into the heart of enemy territory. Outside, America stretched endless and white. Snow blanketed everything. Fields, forests, small towns with church steeples rising like needles into the gray sky. The landscape looked peaceful, untouched by war. No bombed buildings, no charred ruins. No starving civilians digging through rubble. Just pristine snow and wooden houses with smoke curling from chimneys. The contrast was stunning. Many of these women had last seen their hometowns reduced to rubble by American bombs. They had walked through streets filled with corpses. They had tended to burn victims and helped pull survivors from collapsed buildings. The Japan they left behind was a nation destroyed. But here, in the heart of the enemy's homeland, everything stood intact. The houses were whole. The people looked well fed. Children played in the snow as the train passed, but the first thing that struck them was not violence, it was smell. As they were led toward the camp gates, they caught the scent of something cooking. Rich, meaty, warm. Their stomachs clenched. For months, their rations had consisted of rice balls, watery miso soup, and occasionally dried fish. Real meat had become a distant memory. The smell was almost painful in its intensity. The camp itself looked strange. Rows of wooden barracks stood in neat lines, painted and maintained. Guard towers rose at intervals, but they seemed almost decorative compared to the harsh military installations the women had known. Paths had been cleared through the snow. Steam rose from vents. Electric lights glowed in windows. Everything looked organized, clean, almost comfortable. This did not match their expectations of a prison camp. The soldiers spoke in English, their voices flat and businesslike, not cruel, not mocking, just professional. One gestured toward a building, another checked papers on a clipboard, a third opened a gate. The women stood frozen, waiting for the blow that never came. Where were the insults? Where was the violence they had been promised? One young woman, Keiko, a former nurse from Osaka, clutched her small canvas bag tighter. Inside were the only possessions she had left: a photograph of her family, a small mirror, and a comb. She had hidden them carefully, afraid they would be taken from her. The photograph showed her parents and younger brother standing in front of their house. The house was gone now, destroyed in an air raid. Her brother was missing, probably dead. Her parents' fate was unknown. This photograph was all she had left of that life. Beside her, an older woman named Fumiko whispered under her breath, reciting a Buddhist prayer. Her hands shook, not just from cold, but from fear. Fumiko had been a teacher before the war. She had taught children about duty, about honor, about the superiority of Japanese culture. Now she was a prisoner in enemy territory, and everything she had taught seemed questionable. Her daughter was somewhere in the ruins of Tokyo. Her husband had died in Burma. She had nothing left except fear and uncertainty. As they were processed through the gates, each woman was given a number, not a name. just a number written on a card they had to wear pinned to their clothing. The dehumanization had begun, or so they thought. But then something unexpected happened. A female American soldier approached them. She wore a crisp uniform and carried a clipboard, but her expression was not harsh. She was perhaps 30 years old, with kind eyes and a serious demeanor. She explained slowly and clearly in broken Japanese that they would be taken to shower facilities and given clean clothes. The medical officer would check them for illness. Then they would be fed and assigned sleeping quarters. The women's Japanese was better than the American woman's, but the effort itself was surprising. The enemy had learned their language, had made an effort to communicate. This small detail contradicted the image of barbaric Americans who viewed Japanese people as subhuman. If they were truly seen as inferior, why would anyone bother learning their language? The women exchanged glances, showers, clean clothes, food. This did not match what they had been told. One woman began to cry softly. Another gripped her companion's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. They did not understand. Where was the punishment? Where was the revenge? Wait. The fear lingered. Every step toward the processing building felt like walking toward an executioner. Their minds could not reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught to expect. The gap between propaganda and reality was too wide, too confusing, and far more terrifying than simple cruelty would have been. The processing building was warm. The women had not felt real warmth in months. Steam pipes hissed along the walls. The floor was clean concrete. Everything smelled of disinfectant and soap. Medical staff waited, wearing white coats, their expressions neutral but not unkind. One by one, the women were called forward for medical examination. They expected humiliation. They expected rough hands and mocking laughter. Instead, the doctors and nurses were professional, quick, efficient. They checked for signs of disease, malnutrition, and injury. When they found evidence of vitamin deficiency or untreated wounds, they made notes and applied basic treatment. Keiko stood trembling as a female nurse examined her. The nurse was young, probably close to Keiko's own age of 24. She had red hair pulled back in a neat bun and freckles across her nose. She examined Keiko's hands carefully, noting the scars from field hospital work. She checked Keiko's eyes, throat, and reflexes. Then she noticed something that made her pause. Keiko had a burn scar on her left forearm. A bad one from an accident with boiling water in a field hospital. The nurse touched it gently, then looked up at Keiko's face. Their eyes met. The nurse gave a small nod of recognition. Nurse to nurse. Two women who had both spent the war trying to save lives. No words were exchanged, but something passed between them. A flicker of understanding. A moment of shared humanity that transcended national boundaries. Then the examination was over, and Keiko was directed toward the showers. The shower room was the first breaking point. Rows of shower heads lined the walls, towels were stacked on benches, and on a metal shelf sat bars of soap. Real soap. White and clean, smelling faintly of lavender. The women stared at them as though they were precious jewels. For over a year they had washed with whatever they could find. Coarse ash soap that burned the skin. Sometimes just water and sand. Lice had become constant companions. Skin conditions had spread through their ranks unchecked. Some women had developed infections from the constant scratching. Others had simply given up trying to stay clean, accepting filth as part of their new reality. Now here in the enemy's camp, they were being offered real soap. Hot water began to flow from the shower heads, and several women gasped. Fumiko was the first to step under the spray. The hot water hit her back, and she let out a sob. Not from pain, but from the sheer overwhelming sensation of being clean. She picked up a bar of soap, held it to her nose, and tears streamed down her face, mixing with the water and steam. The scent of lavender triggered a memory. Her mother's garden. Before the war. When life was normal and soap was something you took for granted. The memory was so vivid it physically hurt. Around her, other women began to cry as well. Some wept silently, water and tears flowing together. Others openly sobbed, their emotions finally, breaking through the armor of fear they had worn for so long. A few laughed nervously, unable to process the overwhelming sensation. One young woman sat down on the shower room floor and hugged her knees, rocking back and forth as hot water poured over her. The contradiction gnawed at them. They were prisoners. They were supposed to be punished. Yet here they stood, under hot water, holding soap that smelled like flowers, feeling human for the first time in months. It made no sense. It broke something inside them. The certainty they had carried, the hatred they had been taught, all of it began to crack. After showers, dressed in clean prison uniforms that were warm and fitted properly, the women were led to the mess hall. The smell hit them before they even entered. Beef stew, fresh bread, coffee. The aroma was so powerful that several women stopped in the doorway, unable to move. Their bodies responded before their minds could process. Saliva flooded their mouths, their stomachs cramped with hunger. Some felt dizzy from the intensity of their body's reaction to the smell of real food. Inside, long tables were set with metal trays. American soldiers in white aprons stood behind a serving line. They spooned thick stew onto plates. They added slices of white bread, butter glistening on top. They poured steaming coffee into mugs. The portions were not small, they were generous. More food than the women had seen on a single plate in over a year. Keiko took her tray with shaking hands. She sat at a table with 4 other women. None of them touched their food at first. They stared at it. One woman, Yuki, a former radio operator from Kyoto, whispered that it might be poisoned. That this was a trick. A final cruelty before the end. But the smell was too powerful. The hunger too deep. And besides, if the Americans wanted them dead, there were easier ways than elaborate food poisoning. Keiko lifted a spoonful of stew to her mouth. The taste exploded across her tongue. Real beef, carrots, potatoes, onions, rich broth with herbs she could not identify. She closed her eyes and chewed slowly, tears sliding down her cheeks. The texture of real meat was shocking after so long without it. The richness of the broth was almost overwhelming. Her body did not know how to process food this substantial. Around the table, the other women began to eat. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite, making it last as long as possible. Others ate quickly as though afraid the food would be taken away. A few ate mechanically, their faces blank, unable to process the emotional weight of the moment. Yuki ate 3 bites and then had to stop, overwhelmed. She pushed her tray away and covered her face with her hands. Fumiko bit into the bread and had to set it down, overwhelmed. She pressed both hands to her face and wept. Her daughter was somewhere in Japan, probably starving. Her husband had been killed in the Pacific. His body never recovered. She had survived on scraps and determination for so long. Now, in captivity, in the hands of the enemy, she was eating bread with butter. Real butter. Yellow and rich and creamy. The guilt was crushing. Each bite felt like a betrayal of everyone she loved who was suffering while she sat in warmth and safety, eating better than she had in years. An American guard walked slowly through the mess hall, observing. He was young, maybe 22, with a kind face and sandy blonde hair. His name tag read Johnson. When he passed Fumiko's table and saw the women crying, he looked uncomfortable. He seemed to want to say something comforting, but did not. Know the language. Instead, he gave a small nod and moved on. Even that small gesture of acknowledgement felt significant. He had not mocked them. Had not seemed pleased by their tears. If anything, he looked sympathetic, uncomfortable with their pain. The meal continued in near silence, broken only by the sounds of eating and occasional muffled sobs. The women were unprepared for kindness. They had armored themselves against cruelty. But this quiet civility, this basic human decency, was more devastating than any punishment could have been. It forced them to confront the possibility that everything they had been told was wrong, and that possibility was terrifying. After the meal, they were escorted to their barracks. The building was simple but solid, wooden frame construction with proper insulation. Rows of bunk beds lined both walls. Each bed had a mattress, 2 wool blankets, and a pillow. Not just thin mats on the floor, actual beds with springs and cushioning. A small pot-bellied stove stood in the center of the room, radiating warmth. Firewood was stacked nearby. The windows had glass panes, not just boards. Electric lights hung from the ceiling, providing bright, steady illumination. In one corner stood a small table with paper and pencils. They were allowed to write letters, the guard explained through a translator. Letters that would be censored but would be sent. They could communicate with their families, tell them they were alive. Keiko chose a lower bunk near the stove. She sat on the edge of the mattress and pressed down with her hand. It gave slightly, soft. There was actual padding. She lay back, feeling the pillow beneath her head, and stared at the ceiling. The mattress cradled her body. For the first time in over a year, she was not sleeping on packed earth or cold concrete. She was in a bed, with blankets, in a heated room. The physical comfort was almost painful after so long without it. The women unpacked their few belongings in silence. Some placed photographs on the small shelves beside their bunks. Others carefully folded their old clothes, reluctant to throw them away despite their condition. These were the last connections to their former lives. To the world before captivity. To the people they used to be. Each woman handled these remnants with reverence, as though they were sacred objects. As evening fell, the guard returned and explained the rules through the translator. Wake-up call at 6 in the morning. Breakfast at 7. Work assignments would begin tomorrow. Lights out at 10. Talking was permitted. Movement within the barracks was unrestricted, but they were not to approach the fence or attempt to leave the camp. The rules were clear but not harsh. They were treated as prisoners, yes, but prisoners with rights and dignity. Then the guard said something that made every woman in the room freeze. Guards would be posted outside the barracks all night, for their protection. Not to keep them prisoner, to keep them safe. The words hung in the air. Protection, safety. These were not words they had expected to hear in a prisoner of war camp. That first night, none of the women slept. They lay in their bunks, wrapped in warm blankets, listening to sounds they could not quite identify. The creak of the building settling, the distant hum of generators, the occasional voice of American soldiers passing by outside, and every hour, regular as clockwork, the crunch of boots in snow. Keiko lay very still, hardly breathing. She could hear the guard walking the perimeter of their barracks. Slow, steady steps, back and forth. The rhythm was almost hypnotic. He was out there in the freezing cold while they were inside in the warmth, standing watch, all night long. The propaganda had said Americans were cruel, that they would abuse prisoners, that Japanese women would be treated worse than animals. But here was an American soldier, standing guard in sub-freezing temperatures to protect them. From what? From other soldiers? From threats outside the camp? From the possibility of violence or abuse? The very idea that they needed protection rather than punishment contradicted everything they had been taught. In Japan, prisoners were often treated brutally. The concept of protecting enemy prisoners was foreign, incomprehensible. Around 2 in the morning, one of the younger women, Michiko, sat up in her bunk and whispered into the darkness, "Why are they doing this?" Her voice was small, confused, almost childlike. No one answered at first. The question was too big, too dangerous. Then Fumiko's voice came from across the room, quiet and uncertain. "I do not know. I do not understand any of this." Another woman spoke up, her voice trembling. "Maybe it is a trick. Maybe tomorrow the cruelty begins. Maybe they are making us comfortable so the punishment will hurt more." But even as she said it, her voice lacked conviction. The soap had been real. The hot water had been real. The food had been real. The bed beneath her was real. When would the trick end and the punishment begin? How long could they maintain such an elaborate deception? Outside, the boots continued their steady patrol, hour after hour, through the coldest part of the night. The temperature had dropped below zero. The wind howled. Yet the guard maintained his post. The women listened, and slowly something inside them began to shift. Fear did not disappear, but it was joined by something else. Confusion, wonder, a tentative, fragile hope. The first tiny seed of a thought they dared not speak aloud. What if the enemy was not what they had been told? Morning came with a bell, not harsh or jarring, but clear and simple. The women rose, still exhausted despite the comfortable beds, and prepared for whatever came next. They dressed in their prison uniforms and made their way to the mess hall where breakfast waited. Oatmeal with milk and sugar, toast with jam, coffee, orange juice, fresh fruit when available. The variety was stunning. Over the following days, a routine established itself. Each morning, roll call, then breakfast, then work assignments. The work was not brutal. Some women were assigned to the camp laundry, washing and folding uniforms. Others worked in the kitchens, preparing food and cleaning. A few were assigned to maintenance tasks, cleaning buildings or tending to camp gardens that would be planted in spring. Some with language skills were asked to help with translation work. The work was real but not punishing. 8 hours a day with breaks. They were given adequate clothing for their tasks, safety equipment when needed, supervision that was firm but not cruel. The Americans seemed to genuinely care about workplace safety, even for prisoners. When one woman injured her hand in the laundry, she was immediately taken to the medical facility and treated. The injury was documented. She was given lighter duties until it healed. The most surprising part was the payment. Each woman received camp scrip for her work. Small amounts, but real compensation that could be used at the camp canteen. The concept of paying prisoners for their labor was strange. In Japanese military culture, prisoners existed to be exploited. Their labor was extracted without compensation. But here, work was compensated. Even enemy prisoners had economic value and rights. The canteen itself was another shock. Shelves stocked with items the women had not seen in years. Chocolate bars in colorful wrappers, cigarettes, toothpaste and toothbrushes, writing paper and envelopes, hair ribbons, small mirrors, soap, though they were already provided soap, combs, even cosmetics. Small luxuries that felt impossible. The sight of abundance was overwhelming. Keiko saved her scrip for 2 weeks and then bought a chocolate bar. Hershey's. She had heard of this brand but never tasted it. She held it in her hands for a long time before unwrapping it. The brown wrapper crinkled. The smell of cocoa was almost overwhelming, sweet and rich. She broke off a small square and placed it on her tongue, letting it melt slowly. The sweetness made her dizzy. The smoothness of the chocolate was incredible. She thought of her younger brother, who had loved sweets, who was probably dead now, killed somewhere in the Pacific. The chocolate tasted like joy and grief all at once. Letters began to arrive from Japan. Not many, and they came slowly, filtered through military censors on both sides. But they came. Each letter was precious, a connection to a world that seemed increasingly distant and unreal. Fumiko received a letter from a neighbor who had survived the bombing of their neighborhood. The letter was short and devastating. "Your home is gone. Most of the district burned. We are living in shelters made from scrap metal and wood. Food is scarce. We receive rations, but they are not enough. Your daughter is alive but very thin. She works in a factory now. The conditions are poor, but at least she eats. She asks about you every day. She believes you are still alive. I told her yes. I hope I did not lie. Fumiko read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it under her pillow. That night at dinner, she stared at her plate. Pork chops, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh bread with butter, an apple for dessert. More food than her daughter had probably seen in months. The guilt was physical, a weight pressing on her chest. She forced herself to eat because her body needed it, but every bite felt like a betrayal. Other women received similar letters, tales of bombed cities, of starvation, of families living in ruins, of children dying from malnutrition and disease, of elderly parents struggling to survive without support. Meanwhile, in the American camp, the prisoners gained weight. Their skin cleared. Color returned to their cheeks. Their hair became shiny and healthy again. Medical staff treated their ailments. They slept in beds and ate 3 meals a day. Some even began to look younger as the stress and deprivation of war fell away. The contrast was unbearable. One evening, a group of women gathered around the stove in their barracks and spoke in hushed voices about this terrible irony. "We are prisoners," one said, "and we live better than free people in Japan. How can this be? How can the enemy treat us better than our own nation did?" Another woman added, "They have so much abundance here, so much wealth. No wonder they won the war." No one had an answer. The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. It challenged everything they had believed, everything they had been taught about loyalty, about duty, about the superiority of their nation and the cruelty of the enemy. The foundations of their worldview were cracking, and they did not know how to stop it. Each day brought new evidence that contradicted their beliefs. Each kindness was another crack in the wall of certainty. Small moments of humanity began to accumulate. A guard named Private Johnson learned to say good morning in Japanese and used it every day during roll call. "Ohayo gozaimasu." It was badly accented and made some of the women smile despite themselves. He practiced other phrases, too. "Thank you. Please. Excuse me." He carried a small notebook and wrote down new words. His earnest effort to communicate was touching. Another guard, Private Martinez, was caught sharing his cigarettes with prisoners during work breaks. His commanding officer saw but said nothing, just shook his head and walked away. The silent approval spoke volumes. The guards were allowed to be kind, encouraged even. This was not a system that rewarded cruelty or demanded the dehumanization of prisoners. One afternoon, Keiko was working in the laundry when she accidentally knocked over a basket of folded uniforms. They spilled across the floor and she scrambled to pick them up, terrified of punishment. In Japanese military service, such clumsiness would have resulted in a beating or at minimum harsh verbal abuse. But the American supervisor, Sergeant Williams, just laughed and helped her gather them up. "Happens to everyone," he said in English. She did not understand the words, but the tone was clear. No anger, no punishment, just acceptance. Just human understanding of human error. Another time, during a particularly cold morning, one of the guards noticed the women shivering during outdoor roll call and cut the process short. He waved them back inside, saying something to his superior that the women did not understand. Later they learned through a translator that he had argued that keeping them outside in that weather was unnecessary and cruel. He had advocated for them. The enemy had shown them mercy when he did not have to, had put their comfort above strict adherence to procedure. These small kindnesses were more disturbing than cruelty would have been. Cruelty they could understand. Cruelty confirmed what they had been taught. But kindness, consideration, basic human decency, these things did not fit the narrative. They forced the women to see their captors as human beings, as individuals with names and personalities and choices. And once you see your enemy as human, hatred becomes much harder to maintain. Once you recognize humanity in the other, the entire foundation of war propaganda collapses. But every night the boots still walked their patrol. The guards still stood watch in the freezing darkness. And every night the women lay awake listening, unable to reconcile what they heard with what they had been told to expect. The steady rhythm of boots in snow became the soundtrack of their transformation. A constant reminder that the enemy was not what propaganda had promised. By the second month, the women's physical health had improved dramatically, but their mental state was increasingly fragile. They were trapped between two realities. The reality they had been taught, where Americans were cruel monsters who would torture and kill Japanese prisoners, and the reality they were living, where Americans fed them, clothed them, protected them, and treated them with basic dignity. Keiko began to keep a journal. She wrote at night by the dim light near the stove, using paper she had bought at the canteen. Her entries were confused and often contradictory. One night she wrote, "They are the enemy. They killed my friends. They bombed my country. They destroyed my home. I should hate them. Why is hatred so difficult now? Why does my heart refuse to cooperate with my mind?" Another night, The guard tonight is Private Johnson. He has a photograph of his family that he showed me during work today. His sister looks like my cousin. She has the same smile, the same eyes. How can someone with a family that looks like mine be a monster? How can I hate someone whose sister has my cousin's smile? What does it mean that we are so similar? The internal conflict was not unique to Keiko. It spread through the camp like an invisible epidemic. Women who had been certain of their beliefs found themselves questioning everything. Women who had been prepared to die rather than surrender found themselves grateful to be alive. The cognitive dissonance was painful and constant. Their minds struggled to reconcile conflicting information. The stress of holding two contradictory truths was exhausting. Some women clung desperately to their old beliefs. They insisted the kindness was temporary, that the real cruelty would come, that this was all part of some complex psychological torture. They argued that the Americans were simply fattening them up before the slaughter, that the kindness was designed to break them mentally. But as weeks turned into months and the kind treatment continued, even the most resistant began to waver. Reality has a way of wearing down ideology, no matter how deeply it is believed. The barracks became spaces for difficult conversations. Late at night, after lights out, the women would talk in whispers. These conversations were dangerous. They were admitting doubts about things they were supposed to believe without question, but the need to process what they were experiencing was overwhelming. They needed to talk, needed to share their confusion, needed to know they were not alone in their doubts. Fumiko, the oldest among them at 42, became an informal leader in these discussions. She had lived through more than the younger women. She had seen more of the world. She had been educated before militarism took over Japanese society, and she was brave enough to voice what others were thinking but afraid to say. One night she spoke quietly into the darkness. I think we were lied to. About many things. Perhaps about everything. The statement hung in the air like smoke. No one challenged it, but no one confirmed it either. To agree would be to admit they had been foolish, that they had believed propaganda, that they had sacrificed for a cause that had deceived them, that their suffering and the suffering of their loved ones might have been for nothing. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. Everyone knew she was right. No one wanted to say it aloud. Younger women struggled with different questions. Michiko, barely 20 years old, whispered one night about the guards who stood watch. Why do they protect us? We are their enemies. We should mean nothing to them. Our nation killed their soldiers. Why do they stand in the cold all night to keep us safe? What kind of military protects enemy prisoners? Keiko answered softly. Perhaps because they see us as human beings. Perhaps that is enough for them. Perhaps they believe all humans deserve basic dignity, regardless of which side of a war they are on. It is a strange idea, but maybe it is also a powerful one. But this answer raised even more troubling questions. If the Americans saw Japanese prisoners as human beings deserving of protection and decent treatment, what did that say about Japan's treatment of its own people? What did it say about the way Japan had treated prisoners in occupied populations? The questions were dangerous, unpatriotic, possibly treasonous, but they could not be unthought. Once asked, they demanded answers. As spring approached and the Wisconsin snow began to melt, something fundamental shifted in the camp. The women had been prisoners for 3 months. 3 months of regular meals, 3 months of safety, 3 months of being treated not as enemies to be destroyed, but as human beings to be managed with basic decency. And in those 3 months, the foundation of their worldview had slowly, painfully crumbled. They began to understand something profound and disturbing. America's power was not just in its military might or its industrial capacity. America's power was in its ability to show mercy to its enemies, to treat prisoners humanely, to follow rules of war even when it was inconvenient. This was not weakness as they had been taught. This was a different kind of strength, a strength that came from values and systems rather than from fear and brutality. The Geneva Convention was mentioned in camp. The women learned that there were international rules about how prisoners should be treated, rules that America followed even for Japanese prisoners, even though Japan had not always followed those same rules. The guards were required to treat them humanely. The food, the shelter, the medical care, the protection, all of this was not random kindness. It was policy. It was law. It was how America had chosen to wage war. It was a choice to maintain humanity even in the midst of violence. This recognition was devastating. It meant that the difference between their treatment in American captivity and the suffering of civilians in Japan was not accidental. It was not about resources. America had resources and used them to maintain human dignity even for enemies. The difference was in values, in choices, in systems of belief about what human beings owed to each other, even in war. The Americans believed that even enemies had rights, that even in victory there were rules that must be followed, that humanity was not conditional on nationality. Keiko wrote in her journal one night, "The most dangerous weapon is not the bomb or the gun, it is dignity. They have treated us with dignity, and it has destroyed every certainty I once held. I cannot hate people who see me as human. I cannot dismiss a nation that chooses mercy when it could choose cruelty. What does this mean for everything I believed? What does this mean for who I am? If everything I was taught was wrong, who am I? What remains when everything you believe turns out to be false? There was no answer. Just the sound of boots in the night. Still walking, still watching, still protecting. Hour after hour, night after night. A simple act that spoke louder than any propaganda ever could. A constant reminder that the enemy was not what they had been told. That humans could choose kindness. That dignity was possible even in war. The moment of complete transformation came in April, 4 months into their captivity. A severe spring storm hit Camp McCoy. Thunder shook the barracks. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines. Rain pounded against the roof in sheets so loud it was difficult to hear anything else. The temperature dropped suddenly and wind howled through the compound like an angry beast. The women huddled in their barracks, frightened by the violence of the storm. The building creaked and groaned. Windows rattled in their frames. Someone suggested that maybe the guards would take shelter. That maybe, for once, they would abandon their posts and seek warmth and safety inside. It would make sense. It would be reasonable. No one could blame them for seeking shelter in such weather. Only a fool would stand out in a storm like this. But as the storm raged, Keiko lay in her bunk, listening. And through the thunder and rain, through the howling wind and crashing noise, she heard them. The boots, still walking, still patrolling. The guards had not abandoned their posts. They were still out there, drenched and cold and miserable, maintaining their watch. The sound was almost impossible to believe. Who would do this? Who would stand in a storm to protect enemy prisoners? Something broke inside her at that moment. Not broke apart, but broke open. She sat up in her bunk and looked around the dark barracks. Other women were sitting up too, listening to the same sound. The realization spread through the room without words. These men were suffering in the storm to protect them. Japanese women, enemy prisoners. People they had been told were inferior. People they had every reason to hate. People whose nation had killed their brothers and friends. Yet there they were, standing watch, doing their duty, fulfilling their obligation to treat prisoners with dignity and ensure their safety. Not because the prisoners deserved it, not because of any personal connection, but because it was the right thing to do. Because it was what their values demanded, because they had chosen to be better than their worst instincts, because their system of beliefs and laws required it. Fumiko spoke into the darkness, her voice thick with emotion. We are not the enemy to them. We are their responsibility. And they take that responsibility seriously. More seriously than our own leaders took their responsibility to us. The words were treasonous, unthinkable, and completely undeniably true. Everyone in that room knew it. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Keiko felt tears on her face. She was crying, but not from sadness, from release, from the overwhelming weight of finally accepting a truth she had been resisting for months. The enemy was more human than her own propaganda had been. The enemy showed more care for her well-being than her own nation had. The enemy's mercy was more reliable than her own side's promises. These facts were undeniable, and accepting them changed everything. Around the barracks, other women were crying too, some praying, some simply sitting in silence as everything they had believed rearranged itself into a new and strange configuration. They had not been broken by cruelty, they had been transformed by kindness, and that transformation was complete, irreversible. They could never go back to believing what they had believed before. The old certainties were gone forever. When morning came, the storm had passed. The sun broke through clouds, illuminating puddles and wet ground. The women filed out for roll call, and they saw the guards who had stood watch all night. The men looked exhausted. Their uniforms were still damp. Their faces were pale with fatigue. Dark circles hung under their eyes. Their hands shook slightly from cold and exhaustion. But they stood at their posts, maintaining discipline, doing their jobs. Private Johnson was there, the one who said good morning in Japanese every day. His uniform was soaked through. Water dripped from his sleeves. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. His lips had a slight blue tinge from the cold. But when the women filed past, he gave his usual greeting. Ohayo gozaimasu. Good morning? His voice was hoarse but steady. He managed a tired smile. For the first time, the women responded. As one, they bowed. A deep, respectful bow. Not the bow of prisoner to captor, the bow of human being to human being, of gratitude, of recognition, of respect, the bow that acknowledges true honor and sacrifice. The guard looked surprised, then uncomfortable, then touched. He returned the bow awkwardly, unsure of the protocol. It did not matter. The gesture had been made. The acknowledgement had passed between them. Something fundamental had changed. Later, Keiko wrote in her journal, I understand now. The enemy was never America or Americans. The enemy was the lie. The lie that told us they were monsters. The lie that told us we were superior. The lie that said there could be no honor or humanity in our opponents. The real war was not between nations. It was between truth and propaganda. And here in this camp, surrounded by barbed wire and guards, truth won. Truth always wins eventually, though the cost of learning it can be high. The war ended in August 1945. News reached the camp through official channels and then through letters from home. Japan had surrendered. The atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Emperor had spoken on the radio, his voice heard by common people for the first time. The impossible had happened. Japan had lost. The women received the news with complex emotions, relief that the killing had stopped, fear about what surrender meant for their homeland, uncertainty about their own futures, worry about family members who might have been in the bombed cities, and a strange, guilty hope that perhaps now, in peace, Japan might rebuild itself into something better. Something more like what they had seen in America, a nation that valued human dignity and followed rules even in war. But repatriation took time. Months passed while arrangements were made. Ships had to be prepared, transportation organized, paperwork completed, priorities established. The women remained at Camp McCoy through the fall and into winter. A full year in captivity. A year that had changed them in ways they were still trying to understand. A year that had fundamentally altered who they were and what they believed about the world. During this time, the women's treatment did not change. If anything, it improved slightly. With the war over, some restrictions were relaxed. They were allowed more freedom of movement within the camp. Movie nights were organized, showing American films with subtitles. English classes were offered by volunteers. Some of the women began to learn about American culture, American values, American history. They learned about democracy and individual rights and the rule of law. Keiko attended every English class. She was determined to understand this nation that had treated her with such unexpected decency. She wanted to know what created a culture that valued enemy prisoners' dignity. She wanted to understand the systems that made guards stand watch all night in storms. The answers were complex, but they centered around ideas that seemed strange and powerful. That all humans had inherent worth. That even enemies deserved basic rights. That might did not make right. That rules applied to everyone, even to the strong. That power came with responsibility to use it justly. In February 1946, the women were finally told they would be going home. The news should have brought joy. Instead, it brought anxiety. What would they find? What would be left of their homes, their families, their country? And how could they explain what had happened to them? How could they tell their families that they had been treated well by the enemy? Would they be believed? Would they be accused of being traitors? Of having cooperated with the Americans? Of having betrayed their nation? The night before their departure, the women gathered in their barracks one last time. They had lived together for over a year. They had shared the most transformative experience of their lives. Now they would scatter back to whatever remained of their former lives, carrying with them a secret knowledge that would be difficult to share. A truth that many in Japan might not want to hear. Fumiko spoke for all of them. Whatever we find when we go home, we must remember this. We must remember that enemies can show mercy. That humans can choose kindness even in war. That dignity matters, even for prisoners. We must remember the guards who stood watch in the cold. We must remember the soap and the bread and the blankets. Not because America was perfect, but because what we learned here about humanity and choice and values. Those lessons should not be lost. We have been given knowledge that is precious. We must not waste it. In the morning, they boarded trucks that would take them to the train station. As they pulled away from Camp McCoy, Keiko looked back one last time. Private Johnson was there, standing at the gate. He had come to see them off on his day off. When he saw her looking, he raised his hand in farewell. She raised hers in return. A simple gesture of goodbye between two people who had been enemies and who had learned to see each other as human beings. A moment of connection across the vast divide of war. The journey home was long and uncomfortable. The women arrived in Japan to find a country devastated by war and now under American occupation. Cities were in ruins. Food was scarce. The social order had collapsed. But slowly, with American help and Japanese determination, rebuilding began. Democracy was introduced, new laws were written, women gained rights they had never had before. Japan transformed itself from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy. It was a transformation as profound as the one the prisoners themselves had undergone. Keiko returned to Osaka and found her family alive but struggling. Her mother had survived by working in a factory. Her younger brother had been killed in the Philippines. Her father had died of malnutrition just weeks after the war ended. The house was gone, destroyed in the firebombing. They were living in a temporary shelter made from scrap materials. The reunion was bittersweet, joy at survival mixed with grief for those who had not made it. Keiko did not talk much about her time in captivity at first. The shame of having been captured was still strong in Japanese culture. Prisoners were seen as having dishonored themselves by not fighting to the death. But years later, when her children were old enough to understand, she told them the story. She told them about Camp McCoy, about the soap and the bread, about the guards who stood watch all night in storms, about learning that enemies could be human. That mercy was a kind of strength. That dignity mattered even in war. Her daughter asked her once what the most important thing she had learned was. Keiko thought for a long time before answering. I learned that what makes a nation great is not just its military power or its wealth. It is how it treats those who are completely powerless, the prisoners, the defeated, the vulnerable. America was not perfect, but in how it treated us, I saw something worth aspiring to. I saw a nation trying to live up to its values even when it would have been easier not to. That is true strength. That is real civilization. Fumiko lived to be 90 years old. In her later years, she gave interviews about her experiences. She spoke about the contradiction of captivity, about being treated with more dignity as a prisoner than as a citizen, about the transformation that came not from punishment but from unexpected kindness. She said once in an interview that was recorded and preserved, "The cruelty I expected would have confirmed everything I believed. But the kindness I received destroyed those beliefs and forced me to build new ones. That was harder, much harder. But it was also a gift. It gave me the chance to become someone better. Someone who understood that humanity transcends nationality." The women of Camp McCoy scattered across Japan after repatriation, but many stayed in touch. They had shared something that no one else could understand. They had been transformed by an experience that contradicted everything they had been taught, and they carried that transformation forward into the new Japan, into its democracy, into its peace. Their time as prisoners had taught them something valuable about humanity, about choice, about the power of treating others with dignity even when you do not have to, especially when you do not have to. Their children and grandchildren grew up in a Japan that was peaceful and prosperous, a Japan that had learned at terrible cost the lessons they had learned in captivity. And so the sound of boots crunching through snow became more than just a memory. It became a symbol of something profound. The guards who stood watch all night to protect Japanese prisoners of war were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were simply doing their duty, following their orders, maintaining the standards their nation had set for treatment of prisoners. But in that simple act, they demonstrated something important about civilization and choice. They showed that it is possible to maintain humanity even in war, that mercy is not weakness, that treating enemies with dignity does not mean you condone their actions. It means you refuse to let war make you into something less than human. It means you maintain your values even when it is difficult, even when you are tired and cold and standing watch in a storm, even when no one would blame you for doing less, even when the prisoners you protect are from a nation that killed your friends and brothers. For those 342 Japanese women, the sound of boots in the night became proof that the enemy was not what they had been told, that propaganda could be wrong, that humans could choose kindness even when hatred would be easier, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not violence, but the quiet, steady commitment to treating others with the dignity that all human beings deserve. That commitment can change hearts and minds in ways that bombs never could. Keiko kept her journal for the rest of her life. In one of her final entries, written when she was an old woman with grandchildren, she reflected on that first night at Camp McCoy. She wrote, "I expected to die. I expected cruelty and suffering. What I got instead was something far more disturbing and far more powerful. I got proof that the enemy was human, and once you see your enemy is human, everything changes. The guards who stood watch that first night in the cold, they did not know they were changing us. They thought they were just doing their job. But they were teaching us something that no amount of propaganda could overcome. They were teaching us about the possibility of mercy, about the strength in choosing dignity over cruelty, about what it means to be truly civilized. That lesson was passed down through generations, to children and grandchildren who live in a Japan transformed from empire to democracy, who live in peace with former enemies, who understand that nations are not just their military power or economic strength, but their values and choices and how they treat those who cannot fight back. The women who experienced Camp McCoy made sure their descendants understood this truth. The story of the women of Camp McCoy is not widely known. It is not the kind of story that makes dramatic movies or appears in textbooks, but it is important, because it reminds us that even in the darkest times, humans can choose kindness, that even between enemies, dignity is possible, that the sound of boots walking through snow all night to keep prisoners safe is worth remembering, worth telling, worth learning from. These small acts of humanity in the midst of war show us what is possible when we choose to be better than our worst instincts. This is the story worth remembering, not just for what it tells us about World War II, but for what it tells us about humanity itself, about the choices we make, about the values we uphold, about the possibility of seeing enemies as human beings and still maintaining our principles, about the quiet, steady courage of doing the right thing even when no one is watching, even when you are standing in a storm, even when the prisoners you are protecting are supposed to be monsters, about choosing dignity over degradation, humanity over hatred, principle over convenience. The women of Camp McCoy learned that the greatest power is not the power to destroy, but the power to show mercy. Not the power to punish, but the power to maintain humanity even when you have every excuse not to. They learned that true strength comes from values and principles, not just from weapons and armies. And they carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives, sharing it with their children, passing it down through generations. That is their legacy. That is why their story matters. If this story moved you, if it made you think about humanity and dignity and the choices we make even in our darkest hours, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We share these forgotten stories because they matter, because they teach us, because they remind us what is possible when humans choose mercy over cruelty, dignity over degradation, and humanity over hatred. These stories from history are not just about the past, they are lessons for how we should live today. Thank you for listening and for helping us preserve these important memories.